Ancient hatreds and modern weaponry collided when Egypt closed the Straits of Tiran in May 1967. What followed transformed the Middle East forever. In just 144 hours, Israel shattered 3 Arab armies, tripled its territory, and captured Jerusalem's holy sites. Witness how Soviet whispers sparked Egyptian mobilization, how Israeli planes destroyed 300 aircraft in hours, and how paratroopers wept at the Western Wall. The Lightning Campaign rewrote borders, created a refugee crisis, and ignited conflicts still raging today. Experience the 6 days that reshaped history and left wounds that 50 years haven't healed. Ash still lingered in the streets of Port Said when the foreign troops sailed away, their flags folded and their ambitions checked. Egypt's leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, had stared down the combined might of Britain, France, and Israel in the autumn of 1956, and though battlefields told one story, the air of Cairo told another. Songs filled cafes, radios blared speeches of victory, and crowds thronged the boulevards chanting his name. The humiliation of colonial giants made Nasser not merely president of Egypt, but the face of Arab pride. Yet across the border, in Israel, generals pored over maps with sharpened pencils and long memories. Their soldiers had fought well in Sinai. Their tanks had rolled fast and sure, but the world had forced them back. What remained was not triumph, but the sharp lesson that their security could never rest on promises from others. Peacekeepers soon came. The blue helmets of the United Nations Emergency Force, UNEF, settling into windswept posts across Sinai and Gaza. Their convoys rattled along desert roads, a symbol of restraint, but also of fragility. Bedouin herders grew used to the sight of foreign trucks rumbling between dunes, while in the markets of Rafah and El Arish, children chased after soldiers with wide-eyed curiosity. For the first time since 1948, a buffer stood between Egypt and Israel, yet it was only a pause, not a settlement. Israelis called it no war, no peace, a phrase that carried both relief and unease. In Tel Aviv, families breathed easier, but reservists kept uniforms folded and ready, for no one believed the quiet would last. Along the Gaza border, the cycle resumed like a drumbeat. Fedayeen infiltrators slipping across at night, Israeli patrols responding at dawn. A farmer near Kibbutz Nahal Oz ploughed fields with one hand and kept a rifle within reach with the other. In Gaza's crowded alleys, young men whispered of glory and vengeance, their words carried by the wind to refugee camps where tents had turned into shanties. But hopes of return burned as fiercely as ever. Israeli reprisal raids came hard and fast, paratroopers striking at suspected bases, villages waking to explosions, the rhythm of retaliation etched into the lives of border dwellers. To the east, Jordan walked a perilous line. King Hussein, young yet already tested, ruled a land whose western half was a restless prize. The West Bank, seized in 1948, filled with Palestinians who saw Amman as both guardian and jailer. Hussein kept order through careful balance. His Arab Legion patrolled the hills. His secret police monitored agitators, and his speeches promised solidarity with Arab brethren. Yet militants crossed the frontier all the same, and Israeli outposts watched every movement with binoculars. For the Hashemite throne, survival meant suppressing too much zeal at home while proving Arab credentials abroad, a delicate dance that grew harder with every raid. Northward, the Syrian frontier seethed. Around Lake Tiberias and the Huli Valley, disputed demilitarized zones became killing grounds. Farmers on Israeli tractors ventured out under the gaze of Syrian gunners perched atop the Golan Escarpment. At the crack of artillery, workers scrambled for cover as shells ploughed into fields. Kibbutz families carried children to bunkers dug beneath dining halls, while across the line, Syrian villages applauded each strike as defiance. Patrols clashed in reeds and marshes, shots traded at night where borders blurred. The land itself seemed restless, unwilling to accept the armistice drawn in 1949. Superpowers watched this tense frontier with calculating eyes. In Washington, Israel became a Cold War puzzle piece, small but strategic, while Nasser's Egypt tilted toward Moscow, signing arms deals that brought Soviet tanks and MiG fighters into Arab hangars. The Kremlin broadcast his speeches as if they were their own, presenting him as a champion against Western imperialism. The Middle East, long courted for oil and geography, now lay within the logic of global rivalry. Every border skirmish was not merely local, but a potential spark in the East-West contest. Inside Israel, the state itself was changing. Ships docked at Haifa, bringing immigrants from Morocco, Poland, Iraq, and Romania, swelling neighborhoods with new tongues and new tensions. Camps of corrugated tin gave way to towns, while children born in Israel began to outnumber those who remembered Europe's shadows. The army grew with them, reshaping doctrine around mobility, surprise, and the creed of preemption. Officers who had once fought as guerrillas now studied combined arms and rapid deployment. Strategy meetings replayed 1956 with a simple refrain: never again would Israel rely on others to secure its gains. Leadership, too, evolved. David Ben-Gurion, founder and first prime minister, still loomed as patriarch, his white hair and desert kibbutz life part symbol, part stubborn reality. Yet beneath him, factions shifted. Moshe Dayan, with his eye patch and aura of daring. Levi Eshkol, pragmatic and cautious. Younger voices rising in the Knesset and the general staff. Arguments filled smoke-filled rooms, but one consensus held: the state's survival depended on readiness at all times. Meanwhile, ordinary life along the borders bore the marks of constant strain. In Galilee, classrooms carried sandbags beneath windows. In Gaza's refugee camps, children learned the geography of a homeland they had never seen. On Jerusalem's divided streets, Jordanian soldiers watched Israelis across barbed wire, the old city walls standing as both relic and barrier. Pilgrims approached holy places with passes and permits, their prayers echoing through checkpoints. The War of 1948 had left scars unhealed, and each year after Suez only deepened them. By the early 1960s, the fragile balance held, but barely. Skirmishes erupted like brush fires, quickly doused, yet never extinguished. Nasser toured Arab capitals, hailed as champion of pan-Arabism, while Israel tested new jet aircraft over the Negev. In Damascus, radical officers sharpened their rhetoric, broadcasting vows to liberate Palestine. Across the region, radios carried speeches louder than artillery, but no less potent in stirring hearts. The quiet after Suez had stretched a decade, but beneath its surface, the ground trembled. As 1963 dawned, observers could sense the gathering storm. Nothing had been resolved, only deferred. Borders bristled, capitals schemed, and in every home from Cairo to Tel Aviv, from Amman to Damascus, people waited for the next strike. The uneasy decade was ending, and the fuse for something greater had already been lit. And when water itself became the weapon, when engineers with maps and bulldozers stepped into the role once held by soldiers, the region would learn that rivers could start wars just as surely as guns. The desert had not quieted, but the rivers were louder. In 1964, the Jordan itself became a battlefield without bullets, its waters fought over like armies clashing on dry ground. Pipes, pumps, and bulldozers replaced rifles as instruments of strategy, and the flow of a river turned into a declaration of intent. For Israel, its national water carrier, gleaming with steel and concrete, was nothing less than lifeblood drawn from the Sea of Galilee, feeding fields and towns in the Negev. For the Arab states, it was theft in broad daylight, an act they swore to answer not with words alone, but with their own diversion projects. Engineers found themselves wearing the armor of warriors, standing behind surveying tripods as if behind machine guns. On the banks of canals carved by laborers, Syrian and Lebanese overseers watched muddy water surge into ditches that would rob Israel's carrier of its source. Photographs of bulldozers digging channels were splashed across Arab newspapers, triumphantly proclaimed as the first strike in a war of resources. In Israeli towns, the reaction was swift. Cabinet ministers convened, generals demanded action, and farmers imagined taps running dry. Patrols began to guard the pipelines like fortresses. Soldiers crouched in reeds while birds scattered overhead. The river had always been a line of life, but now it was also a fuse. That same year, another force was born, the Palestine Liberation Organization. In a hall in Jerusalem under Jordanian control, men gathered to craft a charter that vowed liberation by struggle, each clause ringing like a drumbeat. Yasser Arafat was not yet at the helm, but the idea had arrived, a body that would speak in the name of the exiles, carrying their banners from camp to camp. Radios in Cairo and Damascus trumpeted the new organization, and young men in Gaza whispered about joining cells that promised action where speeches had failed. Israel's intelligence services watched warily as leaflets crossed borders like contraband, noting names, tracing networks, understanding that something more organized than scattered fidayeen now stalked the frontier. The skies, too, became a battlefield. In 1964 and the years that followed, Syrian and Israeli jets tangled in high arcs above Galilee. Pilots who had once studied blueprints now traced vapor trails across the sky, each duel turning into theater for those watching below. Crowds in Damascus erupted in cheers when MiGs screamed overhead, but the cheers fell silent when they spiraled into the earth-trailing smoke. In Israeli towns, newspapers carried photographs of wreckage, proof of superiority, though funerals followed victories, reminding citizens that every clash bore cost. For both nations, each downed plane was more than metal. It was morale, prestige, and proof of resolve. Egypt watched, uneasy but drawn closer to Damascus. Nasser's speeches began to mention Syria more often, his rhetoric threading Arab capitals together in promises of unity. In meetings of the Arab League, the idea of a united Arab command was raised, envisioning coordination against Israel. Yet behind the grand speeches, the reality of divided interests remained. Jordanians feared being swallowed, Lebanese leaders hesitated. Iraqis sent words more than troops. Still, the image mattered. And on the airwaves, the language was uncompromising. Inside Israel's cabinet rooms, the debate grew sharper. Should retaliation be measured, confined to pinpricks meant to deter, or should it escalate until Damascus itself felt fire? Men like Levi Eshkol weighed the economy against the need to project strength, while generals argued that restraint was read only as weakness. The map of the border bristled with pins marking infiltrations, minefields, skirmishes. Decisions were made in hours, but consequences unfolded over years. Each reprisal risked widening the conflict, yet each act of patience risked encouraging the next raid. Meanwhile, life in villages near the borders became a form of endurance. Farmers in Galilee, tilled fields under the gaze of Syrian gunners, always within sprinting distance of trenches. Bedouins in the Negev warned their children not to wander near tracks where infiltrators might pass. Along the Jordan Valley, patrols picked their way through reeds, wary of ambush, rifles at the ready as waterfowl burst from cover. On the other side, Arab villagers heard Israeli shells whistle across, homes shaking as warning shots became reality. In this theater, civilians were unwilling extras, enduring nightly gunfire as if it were the weather. The mid-1960s were years of brinkmanship made routine. Propaganda filled newspapers with grand promises. Soldiers rehearsed maneuvers with increasing realism, and air raid sirens blared in drills that felt like rehearsals for an inevitable premiere. Egyptian officers studied maps of Sinai. Syrian generals pored over the Golan Escarpment, while Israeli planners rehearsed armored thrusts across open desert. War had not come. Not yet. But every side was preparing for the day when it would. By 1966, the line between skirmish and war had grown perilously thin. Israeli reprisals into West Bank villages sparked Jordanian protests. Syrian artillery answered Israeli plows, and funerals filled calendars in cities from Tel Aviv to Damascus. Radios shouted louder than artillery, promising liberation, revenge, and final victory. Yet beneath the speeches, beneath the parades and exercises, lay a truth all sides sensed. The storm was approaching, and when it broke, it would sweep faster than anyone imagined. The rivers had already been turned into weapons, and the skies filled with duels, but the spark that would ignite the region was yet to come. And when it did, it would not be from a farmer's field or a broken pipeline. It would come from Moscow's warnings, Cairo's ambition, and the chain reaction that would make May 1967 the most dangerous month the Middle East had ever seen. It began with whispers from afar. In May 1967, Soviet envoys leaned across polished tables and told their Egyptian counterparts that Israel was massing divisions near the Syrian frontier. The words, spoken with quiet certainty, carried weight heavier than armies. Maps were unfolded, red circles drawn, reports copied and dispatched. Whether accurate or not mattered less than who spoke them. Moscow's voice reached Damascus and Cairo, and from that moment, the air itself seemed charged. In Damascus, the warnings spread like fire in dry grass. Radios repeated the claim, officers barked orders, and civilians scanned skies as though expecting the sound of Israeli jets. Along the Golan Escarpment, artillery crews shifted, soldiers dug deeper trenches, and the rumor became reality in the minds of those who already believed it. For Syria's leaders, scarred by years of border skirmishes, the threat was confirmation of fears long nurtured, that Israel's next strike would not be a raid across fields, but a drive into the capital itself. Crowds in Damascus, long stirred by speeches of defiance, now murmured with nervous urgency. Posters promising liberation of Palestine hung beside barricades stacked hastily in side streets. University students joined parades shouting solidarity, while mothers guided children away from windows when rumors of Israeli aircraft filled the air. The city lived on adrenaline, unsure if the thunder of artillery practice in the hills was rehearsal or prelude. Nasser, sitting in Cairo with portraits of past pharaohs watching from gilded walls, faced the choice of silence or action. For a decade, he had been the voice of Arab pride, the man who defied Britain and France, the hero of Suez. Could he now ignore Syria's peril without risking his own prestige? In the cafes along Cairo's boulevards, transistor radios blared reports of Israeli threats, and young men argued heatedly about what their president would do. Honor, unity, leadership, these words hummed like electric current through the city. His generals counseled caution, reminding him that Israel had not moved divisions, but his political instincts told him the stage demanded performance. He chose to act, not only for strategy, but for the image of protector. Within days, convoys of Egyptian armor rolled eastward. Dust clouds rose over Sinai roads as T-55 tanks, trucks, and artillery moved toward the desert line. Soldiers leaned out of half-tracks to wave at villagers, chanting songs of Arab unity, while state radio broadcast the deployment as living proof of Cairo's resolve. Posters plastered across the capital declared, "Egypt and Syria, one front." To outside eyes it was framed as deterrence, a shield for Damascus, but in Israeli eyes it looked like a sword being unsheathed. The images swept through Arab capitals. In Amman, shopkeepers closed early, to join crowds watching newsreels of Egyptian tanks grinding across desert highways. In refugee camps near Jericho, elders gathered around radios, their weathered faces lit by hope that long years of exile might be ending. In Damascus, parades cheered the photographs of Nasser saluting troops, hailing him as the man who would finally deliver more than words. Even in Beirut and Riyadh, where caution had tempered earlier enthusiasm, newspapers trumpeted the shift. The leader of Egypt had placed his army between Syria and Israel, and the Arab world took notice. Israel, meanwhile, responded with alarm. Reserve officers telephoned headquarters, offering to report early. Families in kibbutzim, near the Negev, began reinforcing shelters, nailing planks and filling sandbags. Children practiced crawling under desks at school, while their parents studied maps of escape routes. In Tel Aviv, the government convened emergency sessions, the debates loud and anxious. Should they strike first or wait? Should they mobilize fully or trust that words would remain words? The atmosphere in the region thickened. Every radio crackled with speeches. Cairo declared solidarity with Damascus. Damascus vowed vengeance for past air duels. Israel warned it would not stand idle. Crowds filled squares in every capital, waving flags, chanting slogans, convinced that history was turning. Yet behind the noise, leaders weighed calculations more carefully. Nasser sought prestige and deterrence more than immediate war. Syria wanted Egypt committed to its defense. Israel wanted proof before moving, fearful of being blamed for sparking a regional blaze. The superpowers circled nervously around the mounting tension. Moscow had delivered the initial warning, but now worried its client might stumble into catastrophe. Soviet diplomats cabled for restraint, their own intelligence officers quietly conceding that the Israeli buildup had been exaggerated. In Washington, President Lyndon Johnson's advisors debated how far America should go to reassure Israel without being dragged into direct confrontation. The State Department sent careful messages to both Tel Aviv and Cairo, urging calm, while Pentagon analysts studied satellite images for signs of movement. What they saw was limited, but what leaders felt was something larger, a storm building with its own momentum. On Sinai's desert roads, the storm already looked real. Villagers watched columns of armor grind past, endless lines of trucks loaded with supplies, artillery being towed under flapping flags. Bedouin tribes led their camels to waterholes, only to find convoys crowding every route. Pilots at Egyptian bases tested engines at dawn, their aircraft lined in rows that glittered in the sun. For soldiers, the mood mixed pride with unease. They sang anthems in the evening, but many wrote hurried letters home, sensing that their mission might soon turn from display to combat. In Israel, the unease was sharper still. Officers who had lived through 1948 and 1956 read reports and shook their heads. They had seen this pattern before. Reservists recalled how their fathers had been called from fields and workshops in sudden mobilizations and wondered if their own turn was near. The general staff weighed options late into the night, their debates echoing through halls thick with cigarette smoke. Strike first and risk condemnation, or wait and risk disaster. No answer satisfied all. By mid-May, what had begun as a Soviet report had swollen into something larger than fact. Syria believed itself threatened. Egypt declared itself protector. Israel felt cornered. Crowds across the Arab world chanted for confrontation, and in Israeli cities, families stocked cellars with supplies. The desert roads of Sinai carried not only tanks and trucks, but also the weight of choices made far from the sand. Choices that now drove men and machines closer to the brink. And as those convoys idled near forward positions, engines rumbling in the dry heat, the next step was already being prepared. It would be a demand sent to the United Nations, one that would sweep away the fragile barrier still standing between the armies. Once the blue helmets departed, nothing would lie between adversaries but desert and resolve. Engines still rumbled in Sinai when Cairo made its next move. On May 16th, 1967, a letter arrived at United Nations headquarters from Egypt's government, politely but firmly requesting that the peacekeepers who had stood between armies for a decade now depart at once. It was a demand that carried more force than its paper and ink. For years, the blue helmets of UNEF had patrolled lonely desert outposts, their convoys rattling past dunes, their flags fluttering in hot winds. They had been a buffer, a symbol that neither side wished to test. Now, with a single request, that barrier was being swept away. In Gaza, UN soldiers looked on in disbelief as Egyptian officers arrived with official orders. Packing began immediately. Crates were loaded onto trucks, tents folded, radio towers dismantled. Within hours, positions that had taken months to establish were stripped bare. Local residents watched silently as the peacekeepers rolled westward, dust rising behind them, leaving the frontier as naked as it had been in 1956. For Israelis listening to radio reports, the news was like a chill across the spine. The thin line between armies had vanished overnight. Egyptian troops wasted no time filling the void. Tank brigades maneuvered into the very camps UNEF had vacated, and artillery was dragged into place on dunes that offered wide views across the frontier. Engineers hammered stakes, unfurled camouflage netting, and dug trenches under the Sinai sun. For miles, new belts of defense took shape, minefields marked with red flags, anti-tank ditches stretching across roads, sand berms rising like walls against the horizon. Along the Suez Road, convoys stretched as far as the eye could see. In Cairo, state radio celebrated the expulsion of UNEF as a national triumph. Announcers declared that foreign guardians were no longer needed, that Egypt itself now stood guard over Arab soil. Crowds in Tahrir Square waved flags, chanting Nasser's name, while loudspeakers blared military marches. For Egyptians, it felt as if the humiliation of 1956 had finally been avenged. Yet for Israel, the move meant the return of a threat they had sworn never again to tolerate. Egyptian troops sitting astride their southern approaches. The reaction in Tel Aviv was swift. Cabinet ministers gathered in tense sessions as Chief of Staff Yitzhak Rabin and other generals presented maps covered in red arrows showing Egyptian concentrations. Reserve mobilization orders were issued quietly at first, then more broadly. Shopkeepers closed early, professors vanished from universities, and farmers handed fields to sons barely old enough to manage them. Buses carrying uniformed men sped southward, while the economy began to slow under the weight of thousands called to service. World capitals responded in hurried succession. In Washington, President Johnson's advisors debated how to maintain calm while avoiding the impression of abandoning an ally. In Paris, Charles de Gaulle expressed caution, while London called for restraint but offered no solution. Moscow, which had first sounded the alarm, now urged Egypt to avoid further escalation, though its words were muffled by ongoing shipments of arms. The corridors of diplomacy buzzed with cables and calls, but none could alter the facts on the ground. Sinai was filling with Egyptian armor. On May 22nd, the crisis deepened into casus belli. Egyptian authorities announced that the Straits of Tiran, the narrow waters leading from the Red Sea to Israel's port of Eilat, were closed to Israeli shipping. Patrol boats took up position, signals were flashed, and freighters bound northward were halted. For Israel, the act was not symbolic. In 1956, they had withdrawn from Sinai only after receiving international assurances that these waters would remain open. Now that promise lay shattered. The blockade was not just an inconvenience. It was a direct challenge to national survival. News of the closure spread quickly. In Eilat, port workers stared at idle cranes, realizing commerce had been strangled in an instant. Across Israel, radios carried the announcement, and the mood shifted from anxious to electric. Editorials demanded action. Veterans recalled past battles, and young reservists asked not if they would be called, but when. The phrase casus belli echoed through cafes and Knesset halls alike, binding together politicians who had disagreed on almost everything else. For Nasser, the closure was both gamble and gesture. Crowds in Cairo roared approval when he declared that Israeli ships would never again pass through Arab waters. Arab newspapers printed his words in bold type, hailing the moment as the fulfillment of vows made since 1956. In Damascus, Syrian leaders applauded, relieved that Egypt's shield now felt like a sword pointed in Israel's direction. In Amman, King Hussein watched uneasily, aware that Jordan would soon be drawn into events it could not control. Along the frontier, the atmosphere thickened by the hour. Egyptian patrols raised flags over dunes. Israeli jets streaked low in reconnaissance passes, and both armies prepared for the next step. Bedouin tribes shifted camps away from the gathering concentrations, their camels spooked by the constant rumble of engines. In towns on both sides, civilians dug trenches, reinforced shelters, and filled cisterns in case of bombardment. The desert had grown crowded, and every movement seemed to echo louder than before. Diplomats scrambled to buy time. Washington floated maritime proposals, suggesting international convoys might escort ships through the straits. London considered reviving a naval force, but support among allies was thin. Paris, once Israel's arms supplier, now signaled hesitation. Moscow, though cautious, continued to frame events as the natural consequence of Israeli aggression. Each capital offered words, but no one offered ships, and Israel's leaders noted the silence more than the speeches. By week's end, the balance that had held for a decade was gone. The UNEF had vanished in days. Egyptian armor filled Sinai in its place. The Straits of Tiran stood sealed. In Israel, full mobilization loomed. In Egypt, triumph filled airwaves. In Syria, watchfulness hardened into expectation. The chessboard was cleared of buffers, and the pieces faced each other openly. The final hours of May 22nd left little doubt. The line between words and war had thinned to a whisper. Every soldier along the frontier felt it in the way hands tightened on weapons, in the stillness of nights where engines idled but did not shut down. The next move would decide whether the crisis remained a contest of nerves or ignited into flames. As diplomats sent their last cables and generals marked their maps with firmer strokes, ordinary families across the region prepared in their own ways, some by gathering in shelters, others by praying in mosques and synagogues, still others by listening to radios deep into the night. All knew that when dawn came again, the desert might speak not with speeches, but with fire. Dawn broke over Tel Aviv on May 23rd, with streets quieter than usual, but beneath the calm, the nation's pulse raced. The night before, Egyptians had sealed the Straits of Tiran, and the blockade hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown. In government offices, ministers gathered around tables littered with cables and maps, their voices tense with disagreement. Some argued that the time for preemption had come, that hesitation would only embolden Nasser. Others insisted on exhausting every diplomatic path before unleashing the army. The war cabinet divided, not over the danger, but over timing. In the General Staff headquarters, generals outlined options with blunt efficiency. The Israeli Air Force could cripple Egypt's planes in hours. Armor could sweep Sinai roads, and the reserves were already reporting in numbers that astonished even planners. Yet every strike carried the risk of blame, the risk of appearing as aggressor in the eyes of the world. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol listened carefully, his measured responses reflecting the weight of decision. His tone was calm, but aides noticed the furrow in his brow deepening with each briefing. Meanwhile, the Egyptian tide was joined by new allies. On May 30th, King Hussein of Jordan flew secretly to Cairo. In gilded halls, under portraits of past rulers, he signed a defense pact with Nasser. For the young monarch, it was a step taken against his instincts, but under the weight of circumstance. Jordan had long balanced between Arab solidarity and survival, yet the pressure of the moment left little choice. Within hours, Egyptian officers began arriving in Amman, taking seats in joint command posts, their uniforms an unsettling sight for Jordan's own generals. The pact turned Jerusalem into a powder keg. East of the barbed wire, Jordanian artillery already held the high ground. Now, with Egyptian officers in command, the city's vulnerability multiplied. West Jerusalem braced itself, families piling sandbags in courtyards, hospitals preparing wards for casualties not yet arrived. Rabbis led prayers at synagogues packed with worshippers, while church bells echoed across divided streets, calling for peace as soldiers strung barbed wire tighter. Further east, Iraqi units began their own march. Convoys crossed desert highways toward Jordan, their engines echoing in canyons, dust rising in long plumes. In villages along the route, children waved at the columns, believing they were watching history shift in their favor. Syrian forces, already poised on the Golan, tightened coordination with Cairo. From Israel's perspective, the circle was closing. Internationally, the tension reached fever pitch. In Washington, President Johnson received Israeli diplomats who pressed urgently for American guarantees. Johnson's replies were sympathetic but cautious. America was embroiled in Vietnam, and the last thing the White House desired was another war it could not control. In Paris, Charles de Gaulle sent ambiguous signals, no longer the supplier of weapons and backing that Israel had known in the 1950s. In Moscow, Soviet officials urged caution, even as their own rhetoric praised Arab defiance. Each message added more uncertainty than clarity. Inside Israel, the home front bore the strain with quiet determination. City streets sprouted sandbag barricades, public buildings turned into shelters, and radio bulletins repeated instructions on air raid precautions. Families stored water, checked gas masks, and marked the nearest bomb shelters for their children. Posters urged calm, but the sight of buses packed with reservists spoke louder than official reassurances. For 2 weeks, ordinary life existed in the shadow of expectation. In Cairo, the mood was jubilant. Crowds filled squares, chanting that the liberation of Palestine was at hand. Nasser's speeches thundered from loudspeakers, promising that the Arab armies stood united. Egyptian newspapers printed triumphant headlines each morning, accompanied by photographs of tanks massed in Sinai, pilots saluting beside MiG fighters, and commanders poring over maps. Yet beneath the pageantry, Egyptian officers worried about coordination, logistics, and whether allies would match rhetoric with action. In Amman, the mood was more somber. King Hussein walked the tightrope between alliance and survival, aware that war would place his kingdom in mortal peril. Still, his pact with Nasser had bound him to a path he could not easily abandon. Citizens sensed the unease. Refugee camps buzzed with anticipation of return, while merchants stocked goods nervously, uncertain whether customers would return tomorrow or flee at the first artillery salvo. As days passed, the Israeli government wrestled with decision. Generals pressed harder for preemption. Ministers demanded unity in the war cabinet. Demonstrations erupted outside the Knesset, citizens chanting for decisive leadership. Newspapers debated openly, their editorials reflecting the nation's anxiety. Each day of waiting stretched like a year, and the strain showed on Eshkol, whose hesitant speech on national radio failed to reassure listeners. Yet diplomacy continued its dance. Johnson's administration floated ideas of an international naval convoy to break the blockade, a regatta of nations that would escort ships through the Straits of Tiran. London offered quiet support, but enthusiasm among allies proved faint. The plan remained more theory than promise, leaving Israelis doubtful that salvation would come by sea. In the refugee camps across the West Bank and Gaza, rumors spread faster than radio signals. Some whispered that Egyptian armor was already on the move. Others that Israeli jets would strike any day. At night, families gathered in circles, recounting stories of villages left behind in 1948, convinced that a return was imminent. Hope and fear mingled in equal measure, shaping expectations as surely as military orders. The final days before June were heavy with suspense. Israeli pilots flew endless patrols, scanning skies for the first strike. Egyptian columns dug deeper into Sinai, laying more mines, preparing positions. Syrian artillery crews adjusted sights on kibbutzim below, their guns silent but menacing. Along the Jordan River, patrols stared at each other across reeds, fingers on triggers, each side waiting for orders. When June arrived, the region felt like a coiled spring. Diplomats still spoke of peace, soldiers still dug trenches, and families still filled shelters. Yet beneath the routine of waiting, everyone sensed that the choice could no longer be deferred. The blockade remained, the armies faced each other, and the questions that filled cabinet rooms and command posts could no longer be postponed. And on the morning of June 5th, when dawn broke over the Mediterranean, the waiting ended, not with words or cables, but with the roar of engines rising from airfields and the shadow of wings sweeping low across the sea. Long before sunrise on June 5th, Israeli pilots stood in silence beside their aircraft. Engines slept, canopies gleamed faintly under floodlights, and mechanics moved with deliberate care across the tarmac. The order had been given at last. After weeks of debate, hesitation, and dread, the waiting ended in the dark hours before dawn. At 7:45 a.m., the most daring gamble in Israel's history would begin. Operation Focus. The plan had been rehearsed in whispers and maps for months. Nearly the entire Israeli Air Force would rise at once, flying low across the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, their radars switched off, their altitude barely higher than treetops. They would strike not cities, not barracks, but runways. The aim was not to destroy every aircraft in flight. It was to keep them grounded, helpless on shattered strips of concrete. If the attack succeeded, Egypt's vaunted air force, the largest in the Arab world, would be trapped on the ground. Pilots climbed into cockpits, some adjusting gloves with practiced calm, others whispering prayers under their breath. Ground crews slapped fuselages as if wishing luck to old companions. The smell of aviation fuel filled the air, mingled with desert dust carried by morning winds. At 7:10, engines roared to life. Across Israel, from bases in the Negev to strips near the coast, the thunder of jet turbines shattered the night's last quiet. In Cairo, breakfast trays clattered in officers' mess halls as radios carried news bulletins about unity and victory to come. Egyptian pilots reported for duty, expecting another day of patrols, confident that their numbers and equipment gave them the edge. Few noticed that Israeli radar screens suddenly went blank. It looked like a quiet morning, a lull after weeks of tension. The deception was working. At exactly 7:45, the first wave crossed into enemy skies. Israeli mirages and mystères skimmed so low that fishermen at sea mistook them for gulls. The Mediterranean shimmered beneath wings that hugged its surface. In cockpits, pilots gripped controls tight, eyes fixed on the horizon. Radios silent except for clipped instructions. Minutes stretched like hours until the targets appeared. Egyptian airfields spread across the desert. Bombs dropped with surgical precision. Runways erupted in fountains of dust and flame. Asphalt buckled, concrete shattered. At Inchas, Beni Suef, Fayed, and Abu Suwair, MiGs and bombers sat lined like parked cars, their canopies reflecting fire as shrapnel tore through fuselages. Some crews managed to sprint toward planes, only to be cut down by strafing fire. Within minutes, bases that had housed proud squadrons lay in ruins, their aircraft burning where they rested. The second wave followed swiftly. While the first crippled runways, the next targeted hangars, fuel depots and control towers. Communications went silent. Generals at Egyptian headquarters received confused fragments. Reports of explosions, silence from entire bases, contradictory claims that Israeli squadrons had been shot down or were overhead in unstoppable numbers. By 10 a.m., the Egyptian command network frayed into chaos. Israel's pilots circled back, refueled, and returned again. The cycle was relentless. Takeoff, low-level strike, refuel, return. In a matter of hours, the balance of the skies was overturned. Of Egypt's 420 combat aircraft, more than 300 were destroyed or disabled before noon. Smoke columns rose across Sinai and the Nile Delta, visible for miles, signaling the sudden collapse of an entire air fleet. In Tel Aviv, radios that had carried anxious speculation now broke the news cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. The Air Force had struck and struck hard. Citizens emerging from shelters blinked into sunlight with disbelief. Could it really be true? Could Israel, so long under threat, have seized the skies in a single morning? Families hugged in relief, though no official confirmation yet told them the scale of what had been achieved. Jordan entered the war just as the tide shifted. Alerted by Egyptian reports, Jordanian artillery opened fire on West Jerusalem and the Central Plain, while Jordanian hunters took off from Amman to engage. But they flew into skies already dominated by Israeli jets returning from the Egyptian front. In minutes, Jordanian plains fell in flames. The same fate awaited Syrian squadrons that attempted to scramble, only to find Israeli fighters descending on them as if from nowhere. By midday, the balance of air power in the entire region had flipped. In Cairo, panic seeped through corridors of command. Marshal Abdel Hakim Amer, Egypt's military strongman, issued contradictory orders: retreat, counterattack, defend, withdraw. Telephones rang unanswered as bases ceased to respond. Pilots who survived scrambled to relocate aircraft to improvise strips, but most never got airborne. Rumors of defeat spread faster than official communiques, carried by soldiers retreating, by smoke seen from villages, by silence from commanders. For Egyptian troops in Sinai, the change was immediate. The rumble of Israeli jets filled the sky, but no Egyptian planes came to answer. Columns that had once felt shielded now felt exposed. Convoys halted on roads. Soldiers craned necks skyward, waiting for bombs that seemed inevitable. The psychological blow was as devastating as the physical destruction. In Israel, commanders knew the gamble had paid off. By committing almost every plane to the attack, they had left their own skies nearly undefended for the crucial first hour. If Egypt had struck first, disaster would have followed. Instead, surprise held. The nation exhaled in relief, even as its ground forces prepared to move. The shield of air superiority was now theirs, and with it came the freedom to unleash armor and infantry. Morning faded into noon, with smoke still rising from shattered airfields across 3 countries. By the time the sun stood high, the war's first act was already written. The air balance had shifted from perilous parity to near total dominance. Tanks and troops on the ground looked up at skies where only Israeli jets roamed, their wings flashing silver as they circled above. Still, even in triumph, the stakes remained grave. The destruction of Arab air forces guaranteed neither easy battles nor quick victory. On Sinai's sand, Egyptian divisions still waited in their fortifications. In Jerusalem, Jordanian artillery continued to fire. On the Golan, Syrian guns were locked on kibbutzim below. The sky was Israel's, but the ground war was only beginning. As armored columns began to roll forward under the protective umbrella of clear skies, the struggle that had been brewing for a decade now erupted in full. The decisive day had begun, and it would carry its fury into every corner of the Middle East. The morning sky belonged to Israel, and with it came the order for armor to move. Engines growled as columns of tanks and half-tracks surged across desert roads, their commanders confident now that the threat from above had been silenced. Sinai, long a buffer of shifting sands and fortified lines, braced for the shock of an assault that would decide the war's southern front. Egyptian divisions waited inside elaborate defenses. At Katef and Abu Agila, miles of minefields spread like iron carpets, barbed wire tangled in dunes, and bunkers dug deep into ridges. Artillery pieces, concealed in revetments, stood ready to fire on any advance. Egyptian planners believed these positions nearly impregnable, a wall of fire designed to blunt Israel's armor before it could reach the heart of Sinai. On June 5th, as Israeli jets continued to hammer air bases, the ground offensive began. Brigades rolled forward under dust clouds, infantry riding behind tanks, artillery batteries setting up to pound Egyptian positions. At Abu Agila, the key to the Eastern Front, Israel unleashed a carefully choreographed assault. Engineers crawled forward at night, clearing paths through minefields under fire. Infantry stormed trenches with grenades and bayonets, fighting hand-to-hand in choking dust and smoke. Overhead, flares turned the desert night into eerie daylight, casting long shadows of soldiers locked in close combat. Through the night of June 5th, into June 6th, the battle raged. Israeli forces combined arms with precision. Tanks pressed the flanks, paratroopers seized high ground, artillery blanketed enemy batteries. Egyptian defenders fought stubbornly, but confusion reigned as communication lines faltered and orders contradicted. By dawn on June 6th, the supposedly unbreakable fortress of Abu Agela lay shattered. Trenches littered with abandoned helmets and weapons testified to the ferocity of the fight. The breach was open. Once the eastern defenses collapsed, the pace quickened. Israeli columns poured through gaps, racing westward along desert roads. At Khan Yunis and Rafah, fighting flared as Egyptian units tried to hold Gaza's approaches. Street battles turned alleys into gauntlets, machine guns rattling from windows, while tanks blasted walls to clear the way. Civilians huddled in cellars, the thunder of battle shaking houses as soldiers darted through smoke-filled streets. By afternoon, resistance weakened and Israeli armor pressed beyond, linking up with forces advancing along the coastal road. The Gaza Strip itself became a whirl of clashes and withdrawals. Egyptian troops fell back under pressure, their convoys jammed on narrow roads, horns blaring as vehicles collided in panic. In some towns, local commanders tried to organize stand-fast defenses, only to be overrun by swift armored thrusts. Israeli soldiers secured intersections, raising dust-stained flags over captured command posts, while prisoners lined up under guard, their faces blank with exhaustion. Deeper in Sinai, chaos spread. Egyptian commanders issued retreat orders, but the pace of Israeli advance turned withdrawal into rout. Convoys jammed the desert highways, trucks loaded with soldiers and equipment, bumper to bumper, under blazing sun. When air raids descended, panic erupted. Drivers swerved off-road, vehicles overturned, weapons scattered across sand. Abandoned tanks smoldered by the roadside, their crews fleeing westward on foot. What had begun as orderly movement became an uncontrolled flood. At the Mitla and Gidi passes, the gateways through Sinai's central ridges, Israeli spearheads pressed hard. Tanks roared into canyons, their guns firing at retreating columns, while engineers worked frantically to clear wreckage, blocking the narrow routes. Each kilometer taken brought the army closer to the Suez Road, the artery linking Egyptian forces to their homeland. By the evening of June 6th, spearheads stood poised within striking distance of that lifeline. Back at the front, the psychological tide had fully turned. Egyptian soldiers, once confident behind defenses, now felt abandoned. Rumors spread of collapsed air forces, of destroyed command posts, of orders issued and rescinded within minutes. Some units held firm, firing until ammunition ran out. Others melted into the desert, their weapons discarded in sand. Villagers along the Suez Road watched stunned as defeated troops streamed past, their once proud convoys reduced to broken fragments. Israeli troops pressed relentlessly, but exhaustion weighed heavy. Many had fought without pause since dawn on the 5th, digging trenches, storming bunkers, and then chasing retreating forces for miles. Yet the momentum carried them forward. Officers urged speed, reminding men that every hour gained widened the breach and prevented Egyptian regrouping. Supply convoys rattled behind, bringing water and ammunition, while medics tended wounded in hastily cleared shelters. The victory at Abu Agela became legend within hours. Soldiers who had fought there spoke of night, turning to day under flares, of trenches taken yard by yard, of comrades falling beside them yet urging the advance. Commanders praised the battle as proof that training and coordination could break even the strongest fortifications. For Israel, it was more than a tactical win. It was a symbol that the war's outcome might truly tilt in their favor. By nightfall on June 6th, Sinai's eastern front was in tatters. Israeli columns stretched deep into the desert, their tracks etched across dunes toward the canal. Egyptian units streamed westward in disarray, equipment abandoned, morale crumbling. In Gaza, the sound of gunfire faded as towns came under Israeli control. The way lay open towards central Sinai, where the next decisive thrust would unfold. And as the desert echoed with the retreat of one army and the advance of another, the war widened elsewhere. In Jerusalem, artillery thundered, shells struck homes, and a new front opened in the city, holy to three faiths. While Sinai unhinged, another battle was beginning. One fought not in empty desert, but among stone walls and narrow streets. The war's first shock in the south had hardly subsided when Jerusalem felt its own eruption. By mid-morning on June 5th, Jordanian artillery opened up from the ridges to the east, their guns booming across the city's divided heart. Shells crashed into West Jerusalem, shattering windows and tearing holes in narrow stone streets. Smoke rose above neighborhoods that had waited tensely for days, and the holy city once more found itself a battlefield. Families fled to shelters, dragging mattresses and pots into cellars darkened by candlelight. In Kataman, a mother rushed her children down stairwells as plaster rained from ceilings. In Rehavia, old men muttered prayers as they huddled beside gas lamps. Schools that had tried to maintain routine emptied into trenches dug weeks before, teachers ushering children with urgent whispers as explosions rattled the ground. Hospitals shifted instantly to emergency footing, clearing corridors and bracing for the wounded they knew would come. At Hadassah, nurses laid out stretchers, the sounds of artillery mingling with the whir of generators. The barrage was not confined to neighborhoods. Jordanian gunners struck at Israel's government quarter, hitting the Knesset's grounds and damaging surrounding offices. Shells landed near the Prime Minister's residence, scattering staff. Even the city's symbols of endurance felt fragile under the pounding. For civilians, it seemed that nowhere was beyond reach. Israeli leaders had not sought war with Jordan. For weeks, they had hoped King Hussein would remain neutral, wary of risking his throne in a larger conflict. But as shells rained on the capital, indecision ended. Orders went out: silence the batteries, secure threatening positions, and prepare for broader action if the shelling did not stop. The defensive stance that had guided Israel's policy toward Amman gave way to urgency. Israeli forces moved quickly. Infantry units advanced on the high ground south of the city, aiming to knock out positions dominating Bethlehem Road. Tank crews maneuvered into western suburbs, their guns searching for Jordanian emplacements across the line. Artillery batteries answered barrage with barrage, sending thunder rolling back toward the Mount of Olives. In the city's east, Jordanian soldiers returned fire from trenches and houses, the line between battlefield and neighborhood vanishing in minutes. One key objective stood on a ridge just outside the city: Government House, the old British Mandate headquarters that the UN had used since 1948. Its location commanded views of the southern approaches, and Jordanian forces had fortified the grounds. Israeli troops stormed the ridge under fire, grenades and automatic bursts echoing across the valley. By midday, the position was theirs. From its windows, officers now surveyed the terrain where further battles would unfold. Civilians lived the war in ways that statistics never captured. Clergy opened church courtyards to frightened families, guiding them into crypts that had sheltered generations of worshippers from earlier wars. In synagogues, prayers mixed with the percussion of distant artillery, while in hospitals, Chaplains whispered blessings over the wounded brought in by ambulance. Jerusalem's overlapping faiths all heard the same sound, the thud of shells on ancient stone. Jordanian troops fought with determination. Mortar teams set up in gardens and alleyways, firing at Israeli positions on the western edge. Machine gun nests in fortified houses swept roads with bursts that pinned down advancing patrols. Near Latrun, where Israel had fought bloody battles in 1948, Jordan's Arab Legion clashed with Israeli units again, the old battlefield once more echoing with rifles and grenades. Skirmishes broke out near Hebron Road, where patrols collided in narrow gullies, trading fire at close range. For Israel's commanders, the question of scope loomed larger with each hour. Should the fight remain contained to protecting Jerusalem, or should they strike across the West Bank to silence artillery at its source? Reports poured in, shells hitting hospitals, civilian casualties mounting, communication lines under strain. In cabinet meetings, Prime Minister Eshkol listened as generals pressed for broader action. Limiting the battle no longer seemed sustainable. Across the barbed wire in East Jerusalem, the mood was equally tense. Jordanian commanders received conflicting messages from Cairo, which claimed massive victories in Sinai, even as Egyptian positions crumbled. Believing their allies' reports, Jordan's officers pressed harder, convinced the tide of battle was in Arab hands. Ammunition was rushed to forward positions, reinforcements dispatched from Jericho, while propaganda broadcasts promised triumph. Civilians in East Jerusalem bore the weight as well. Families in the old city gathered in courtyards, listening for sirens or the sudden roar of aircraft. Merchants shuttered shops, fearing looting as much as shelling. Mosques echoed with prayers for victory, while Christian pilgrims found themselves trapped behind walls now lined with sandbags. The city's sanctity offered no shield. Its residents, like those across the barbed wire, endured fear and uncertainty. By late afternoon, the pattern of fire and counterfire grew relentless. Israeli units tightened control of ridges south of the city, while Jordanian batteries hammered western neighborhoods with stubborn persistence. Ambulances rushed through streets strewn with glass and debris, their sirens competing with church bells and the calls of muezzins. In living rooms, families gathered around radios, straining for updates that might make sense of the chaos outside. The first day's battle left scars both physical and psychological. Jerusalem, already divided by walls and checkpoints, was now divided by fire. The old city loomed under smoke, its minarets and domes silhouetted against skies lit by flares. West Jerusalem's residents spent the night in cellars, whispering reassurances to children who woke at every distant boom. East Jerusalem's families, equally fearful, listened to official announcements that claimed victory even as explosions shook their streets. When the shelling eased, silence settled heavy over the city. It was not peace, but anticipation, as both sides prepared for what would come next. For Israel, the debate tilted toward decisive action. Artillery alone could not protect civilians, and as long as Jordanian guns remained in place, Jerusalem would bleed. For Jordan, hopes of holding the city rested on promises of Egyptian reinforcements that would never arrive. The opening moves of June 5th had made clear that Jerusalem was no longer a secondary theater. Its neighborhoods, its holy sites, its people were now central to the struggle. The fight for control of the ridges and approaches was only the prelude. The next day would bring battles closer still, trench by trench and street by street, until the question of who held the city was answered not by shells but by soldiers. Night descended on Jerusalem with the sound of artillery still echoing among its valleys. Fires smoldered in western neighborhoods, and across the barbed wire, Jordanian guns remained active. Israeli commanders knew that defensive counterfire alone would not silence the threat. If the city was to be secured, they would need to strike at the fortified positions guarding its approaches. The strongest of these lay to the north. Ammunition Hill. Originally built by the British as a storage depot, Ammunition Hill had become a Jordanian stronghold. Trenches snaked across its slopes, bunkers reinforced with concrete and steel, and machine gun nests covered every approach. The position linked to Jordanian forces in the Sheikh Jarrah quarter and blocked the road to Mount Scopus, where an isolated Israeli enclave had sat cut off since 1948. Taking the hill was essential. Just before midnight on June 6th, Israeli paratroopers prepared for the assault. Their faces were streaked with dust and sweat, helmets strapped tight, weapons loaded. Commanders whispered final instructions over maps spread under dim lanterns. Each man knew the reputation of Ammunition Hill. Every trench, every bunker, every yard would need to be fought for by hand. At 2:30 a.m., the attack began. Artillery pounded the hill, shaking the ground with thunderous blasts. Under the barrage, infantry advanced, crawling through barbed wire and stumbling across craters. Machine guns opened from the Jordanian side, tracers cutting through the night. Grenades exploded in bursts of orange, lighting trenches filled with struggling figures. Paratroopers leapt into dugouts, bayonets and rifle butts swinging in desperate close combat. The battle devolved into a series of brutal clashes, fought at distances measured in steps. Israeli soldiers shouted orders over the roar, some calling for medics, while others pressed forward, regardless of losses. Jordanian defenders counterattacked fiercely, their discipline holding despite the bombardment. Many positions changed hands more than once before dawn. Hours dragged by in a haze of smoke, shouts, and gunfire. By morning, Ammunition Hill was a scarred ruin. Bodies lay in trenches, helmets scattered across sandbags blackened by smoke. Israeli troops stood exhausted, faces smeared with grime, weapons nearly empty. 70 paratroopers had fallen in the fight, but the stronghold was theirs. With it, the road to Mount Scopus reopened, and the northern barrier to East Jerusalem was cracked. Survivors spoke in hushed tones of comrades lost in hand-to-hand struggle, the hill's silence afterward more haunting than its noise. Elsewhere, Israeli forces tightened their grip around the city. Units advanced from the north through French Hill, encircling neighborhoods east of the old city. To the south, troops moved from Government House Ridge toward Abu Tor, securing approaches to the southern walls. Step by step, the ring around East Jerusalem closed. Jordanian resistance remained determined, but communication faltered as Israeli pressure increased on multiple fronts. Within the city, civilians endured terror on both sides of the divide. In West Jerusalem, families ventured from shelters to fetch water, listening for the thud of shells that might fall again at any moment. In East Jerusalem, residents heard firefights echoing closer, saw soldiers digging in along streets, and feared what the next day would bring. Priests prayed in candlelit chapels. Imams urged calm from minarets, while the walls of the old city loomed in silence, their gates sealed against the encroaching war. On the morning of June 7th, Israeli commanders made the fateful decision. The old city itself would be taken. Orders spread quickly. Paratroopers were to enter through Lion's Gate. Soldiers assembled at St. Stephen's Gate Road, their nerves taut, aware of the weight of history pressing upon their mission. For many, the idea of stepping into the old city's alleys, closed to Israelis since 1948, was almost unimaginable. At first light, the advance began. Tanks rolled forward to provide covering fire, their guns booming against Jordanian strongpoints. Paratroopers dashed through the gate under fire, spilling into the narrow streets beyond. Stone houses amplified every sound. The crack of rifles, the crash of explosives, the echo of shouted commands. Residents peered through shutters, some fleeing into basements, others frozen in fear as soldiers surged past. Step by step, the troops advanced through winding alleys toward the Temple Mount. Machine guns fired from windows, forcing soldiers to storm buildings, room by room. Grenades echoed in courtyards where fig trees grew, their branches shaken by shockwaves. The smell of dust and smoke clung to every breath, yet the momentum never faltered. Within hours, resistance thinned, Jordanian forces retreating toward the city's western exits. By mid-morning, Israeli soldiers reached the Haram al-Sharif. The dome of the rock shimmered under a sky cleared of smoke, its golden surface reflecting the light of dawn. Commanders ordered strict restraint. No fire within the holy compound, no desecration of sacred ground. Troops secured perimeters carefully, mindful of the sanctity that drew billions of prayers. From there, they pressed toward the western wall. When paratroopers finally stood before the ancient stones, silence fell among them. Helmets were removed, rifles lowered. Some pressed hands to the wall, others wept openly, their shoulders shaking with emotion after 2 decades of separation. Rabbis hurried forward, blowing shofars, reciting blessings. Soldiers scribbled notes and placed them between the stones, mingling prayers with dust still falling from artillery strikes. For a moment, the noise of war gave way to awe. In the old city's quarters, the transition was swift. Israeli troops established security cordons, guiding civilians through checkpoints, posting guards at holy sites. Religious leaders met with officers to guarantee access and prevent desecration. The Mughrabi quarter, pressed against the wall, was cleared in the days that followed to open space for worshippers, its centuries-old homes giving way to bulldozers under the eyes of stunned residents. For Jordan, the fall of Jerusalem marked a devastating blow. Commanders issued retreat orders across the West Bank, sensing that defense of the city was impossible. King Hussein, once reluctant to enter the war, now faced the loss of its most cherished jewel. Radios in Amman announced defiance, but soldiers and civilians alike understood the reality. The old city, after 19 years, was no longer theirs. By evening, on June 7th, the battle for Jerusalem was finished. The guns fell silent. The city, divided since 1948, now joined under one authority. Streets were scarred, houses ruined, and families grieving, yet history had turned a page in the space of 2 days. For Israel, it was a triumph mingled with sorrow. For Jordan, a wound that cut deep. The war still raged across the West Bank and Sinai, but Jerusalem's fate was sealed. When the old city's gates fell on June 7th, Jerusalem was no longer the only prize in sight. Across the hills and valleys of the West Bank, Jordanian forces still manned fortified towns, controlling ridgelines that dominated Israel's heartland. For Israeli commanders, leaving those positions intact meant continued shelling of cities and the threat of counteroffensive. Orders went out: advance on all fronts, seize the key strongholds, and drive Jordan's army across the river. The northern front erupted first. At Jenin, Jordanian armor and infantry dug into defensive lines that shielded the road north to Nablus. The terrain favored defenders, narrow passes, rocky hillsides, and urban choke points that could stall advancing armor. Israeli columns rolled forward at dawn, their Centurion tanks flanked by half-tracks filled with infantry. The clash came swiftly. Jordanian tanks, hulking patterns supplied by the United States, opened fire from concealed ridges. Shells thundered into Israeli armor, knocking out several vehicles in the opening exchange. For a time, the valley echoed with the roar of dueling cannons, explosions tossing dirt high into the air. Smoke obscured the battlefield, and both sides maneuvered in deadly cat and mouse through olive groves and stone villages. Infantry pressed into alleys, rifles snapping, while mortars thudded across the hills. By midday, Israeli reinforcements pressed the attack. Air support, unchallenged after the devastation of Arab air forces, strafed Jordanian positions with rockets and bombs. Under the relentless assault, the defenders wavered. By evening, Jenin's strong points collapsed. Streets that had echoed with battle fell silent except for the rumble of engines moving westward. Jordanian units retreated toward the river, leaving wrecked armor smoldering by the roadside. South of Jenin, the ridgelines around Nablus became the next battlefield. The city sat like a citadel between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, its narrow approaches perfect for ambush. Israeli columns advancing along the Sumerian hills encountered determined resistance. Jordanian troops, many veterans of earlier skirmishes, turned every bend into a trap. Snipers in rocky outcrops, anti-tank teams waiting in ravines, mines hidden along culverts. Progress slowed to a crawl. Paratroopers dismounted to clear positions on foot, advancing ridge by ridge. Artillery softened defenses, sending echoes rolling through the valleys. Civilians sheltered in basements as shells shook the city above. By the morning of June 7th, Nablus lay encircled. Commanders weighed the prospect of urban combat that could devastate the ancient town, but Jordanian forces, cut off and outnumbered, began withdrawing rather than risk annihilation. Israeli units entered cautiously, establishing checkpoints at markets and crossroads, their presence both tense and commanding. Further south, the thrust toward Bethlehem and Hebron unfolded at speed. Israeli units advancing from Jerusalem pushed beyond Beit Jala, their tanks clattering along roads lined with abandoned barricades. Bethlehem's defenders offered only sporadic fire before falling back. Soldiers entered the town, passing the Church of the Nativity with reverent silence, aware of its sanctity even amid war. Civilians emerged hesitantly, some waving white cloths, others simply watching in shock as new flags appeared on rooftops. Hebron, farther to the south, presented a more complex challenge. Its garrison prepared to fight, but faced columns that had already outmaneuvered their positions. Skirmishes flared on the outskirts, rifles crackling among stone houses, but the Jordanian defense unraveled quickly. By afternoon, Israeli armor rolled into the city center. Troops encountered tense stares from residents standing in doorways, many fearful of what occupation would bring. Commanders issued strict orders. Holy sites were to be respected, civilians left unharmed. But military control was absolute. Across the West Bank, the tempo of advance stunned both sides. In less than 48 hours, towns that had seemed secure were overrun. Roads filled with columns of prisoners, some marching in lines with hands raised, others sitting exhausted by roadside awaiting transport. Israeli officers organized processing points, weapons collected, soldiers searched, documents recorded. For the prisoners, many of whom had fought bravely, but without air cover or reinforcements, defeat was bitter but undeniable. The rapid advance strained Israel's own logistics. Bridges collapsed under shell fire, culverts blown by retreating forces, roads clogged with captured equipment. Supply convoys worked furiously to keep pace, delivering fuel, ammunition, and water to forward units. Mechanics toiled beside dusty roads to repair damaged tanks, while medics treated wounded in makeshift stations set up in schools and mosques. War demanded not only bravery, but organization, and both were tested to the limit. Civilians throughout the West Bank faced upheaval. Villages awoke to the sight of new troops in their streets, checkpoints at every corner, and orders shouted in unfamiliar accents. Some fled toward the Jordan River, joining columns of refugees that grew by the hour. Others stayed, uncertain whether resistance would bring worse consequences. In marketplaces, silence replaced the usual bustle. Shop doors closed, and families huddled indoors until they understood what rules would govern them now. By the evening of June 7th, Israel held most of the West Bank's major towns. Jenin, Nablus, Bethlehem, Hebron, all had fallen or stood encircled. Patrols secured roads, while engineers worked to reopen bridges and crossings. Commanders reported back to Tel Aviv that the territory was effectively in Israeli hands. Jordanian forces retreated eastward, some across makeshift pontoon bridges into the East Bank, others scattering into villages, their cohesion gone. For Israel, the success was staggering in speed and scope. What had begun as a defensive response to artillery fire now meant control over cities holy to 3 religions and home to hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. Soldiers who had marched through stone streets hours earlier now stood watch on rooftops, gazing toward the Jordan River, where the last flashes of battle flickered. The West Bank campaign was not without cost. Casualties filled hospitals, columns of dead were mourned quietly by comrades, and the weight of occupation settled quickly on weary troops. Yet the momentum of the war carried forward, leaving little time for reflection. Orders came to prepare for the next stage, for Sinai still smoldered, and elsewhere the war's tide had not yet reached its crest. The roads of Sinai told the story before communiques reached the capitals. Burned-out trucks lay scattered along the asphalt, rifles abandoned in ditches, boots and helmets left behind by men who fled westward without looking back. Israeli columns pressed relentlessly across the desert, their tanks cutting through the chaos of retreating Egyptian units. Soldiers who had begun the week with confidence now streamed toward the Suez Canal in disarray, their formations shattered by airstrikes and armored thrusts. At Abu Ajala and along the coastal road, the previous day's battles had already broken Egypt's defensive belt. Now, with skies firmly under Israeli control, the retreat turned into collapse. Convoys jammed the narrow causeways, engines overheating under the desert sun. Pilots swooped low to strafe vehicles, scattering troops into the sand. Entire battalions dissolved as men abandoned equipment and sought refuge in the vast emptiness. The proud divisions that had entered Sinai with drums and fanfare were reduced to fragments stumbling west. Amid the rout, Israeli spearheads surged forward. One column raced toward the Mitla and Gidi passes, blasting aside stragglers and wreckage to seize the gateways into central Sinai. Another advanced southward along the coastal highway, aiming for Sharm el-Sheikh at the tip of the peninsula. Commanders urged speed, knowing that every hour mattered. The sooner they reached the canal and the straits, the sooner Egypt's capacity to fight would vanish. At Sharm el-Sheikh, Egyptian defenders clung to rocky outcrops overlooking the Straits of Tiran. The narrow waters, closed by Nasser on May 22nd, had sparked the war. Now they became its symbol. Israeli paratroopers landed nearby, supported by naval vessels offshore. The defenders fought hard, but were overwhelmed. By the afternoon of June 7th, the tricolour flag of Israel flew above the straits. Ships in Eilat received the signal. The maritime lifeline was open once more. In Cairo, the mood turned from triumph to despair in a matter of hours. Only days earlier, radio broadcasts had declared Egyptian victories, speaking of Tel Aviv in flames and Israeli forces retreating in panic. Now, the truth became undeniable. Reports flooded in of shattered divisions, missing commanders, and an enemy advancing almost unopposed. Crowds gathered in public squares, their chants of defiance replaced by stunned silence. Families searched lists for news of sons and brothers who had not returned from Sinai. Inside the high command, confusion reigned. Field Marshal Abdel Hakim Amer, Nasser's trusted ally, issued frantic orders, some demanding counterattacks, others calling for retreat. Commanders on the ground, cut off and disoriented, often received conflicting instructions within minutes. Telephone lines buzzed with contradictory messages, while telegraphs carried pleas for reinforcements that no longer existed. It was the unraveling of an army in real time. By June 8th, Israeli tanks reached the western edge of Sinai, their treads grinding to a halt on the banks of the Suez Canal. Soldiers gazed across the water at the factories and cities of Egypt proper. The war had carried them farther than they had dared imagine only days before. Behind them lay hundreds of miles of desert, now strewn with wreckage, evidence of a decisive victory, but also of the scale of destruction. That same day, Egypt agreed to a ceasefire. Orders went out for guns to fall silent, but compliance was uneven. In some sectors, Egyptian units continued to fire as they retreated, either unaware or unwilling to accept the collapse. Skirmishes flared, even as white flags rose elsewhere. Israeli troops advanced cautiously, wary of ambushes in the final hours. By evening, Sinai was effectively under Israeli control. Far from the desert, another drama unfolded at sea. On June 8th, the USS Liberty, an American signals intelligence ship, cruised in international waters off the Sinai coast. Its antennas bristled skyward, intercepting the chatter of war. Shortly after noon, Israeli aircraft mistook the vessel for an enemy ship. Attack jets swooped down, unleashing rockets and cannon fire. Within minutes, the Liberty was ablaze. Torpedo boats joined the assault, one weapon ripping a massive hole in the hull. Desperate crewmen fought to save their ship. Fires raged below decks. Sailors carried wounded comrades to improvised aid stations, and distress calls crackled across radios. Only belatedly did Israeli command realize the mistake. The attack ceased, and frantic messages of apology followed. The toll, however, was grievous. 34 Americans killed, more than 170 wounded. Diplomatic cables flew instantly between Washington and Tel Aviv, anger and regret colliding in hurried exchanges. The incident threatened to overshadow battlefield triumphs, reminding all how easily confusion could ignite greater conflagrations. Back in Sinai, Israeli troops confronted the aftermath of victory. Miles of highways were lined with destroyed vehicles, the air heavy with smoke and the stench of fuel. Prisoners of war gathered in vast encampments, many dazed and silent, others demanding water in the parched heat. Medics moved among them, tending wounds with hurried efficiency. For Israeli soldiers, the sight was both exhilarating and sobering, proof of overwhelming success, yet also of the human cost etched into every abandoned boot and burned-out truck. Civilians in the region faced upheaval as well. Bedouin tribes who had lived along the peninsula's sparse oases found themselves caught between armies. Some fled deeper into the desert, while others cautiously approached Israeli convoys, seeking safety. At Sharm el-Sheikh, fishermen ventured back to the shore, watching warily as soldiers patrolled rocky beaches where tanks now stood. The rhythms of ordinary life would not return soon. By the close of June 8th, Egypt was out of the war. Its air force lay in ruins, its army scattered, its territory across Sinai occupied. For Israel, the strategic threat from the south had been neutralized with a speed that astonished even its own commanders. Yet as radios carried news of the ceasefire, the fighting was far from finished. To the north, Syrian guns still shelled Galilee, their artillery perched high on the Golan Heights. The desert campaign had ended with Israel standing at the banks of the canal, its heartland safe from southern attack. But new orders were already forming. The war's next chapter would be fought not in the sands of Sinai, but on the steep escarpments overlooking the Jordan Valley. The Golan still bristled with guns, and its fate would be decided within days. Though the war looked settled in Sinai and the West Bank, Israel's northern frontier told another story. Syrian fire still tore into the Galilee, even as the rest lay under silence and new rule. From the escarpment of the Golan Heights, batteries lobbed shells into kibbutzim spread below, their rounds smashing fields and scattering livestock. Families huddled in bunkers dug beneath communal dining halls, listening to the whistle of incoming fire. For years they had lived under this menace, but now, with Israel's other fronts secure, the call grew louder. The Golan must be taken. In Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, the debate was heated. On June 8th, the cabinet met to consider whether to open a new front. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol hesitated. Israel had already won stunning victories, and diplomacy was pressing for ceasefires. Opening a fresh offensive risked international censure, even Soviet intervention. Yet generals argued fiercely that leaving the Golan untouched meant condemning Galilee to remain under the shadow of artillery. Yigal Allon, Moshe Dayan, and others presented maps showing the narrow strip of land at Israel's northern edge, a valley overlooked entirely by Syrian positions. Every tractor ploughing a field, every child walking to school, lay in sight of gunners perched above. To leave those guns in place, they insisted, was to waste the war's hard-won momentum. Reports from villages below reinforced the urgency. Farmers described shells cutting irrigation lines, homes collapsing in bursts of smoke. Children were carried to shelters at the sound of warning horns, emerging hours later to find orchards shredded. Each story reached the cabinet, weighing heavily on the ministers. After long argument, Dayan delivered the final push. With the south secured and the center won, the time had come to break the last threat. Orders were given. The Golan would be attacked. The operation posed enormous challenges. The Golan Heights rose like a wall, cliffs and ridges layered with defenses. Syrian engineers had built bunkers of steel and concrete, trenches zigzagging across the slopes, and minefields so thick they seemed impassable. The approach would mean climbing under fire, tanks grinding through narrow defiles while infantry clawed uphill. It was a task avoided in earlier wars for good reason, but with air supremacy secure and morale high after victories in Sinai and the West Bank, commanders believed the impossible could be attempted. At dawn on June 9th, Israeli artillery thundered across the border. Dozens of batteries unleashed a storm of shells, pounding Syrian strongpoints. The bombardment shook the ground from Kiryat Shmona to the Sea of Galilee, plumes of smoke rising like dark pillars over the heights. Syrian communication lines snapped under the barrage, their command posts rattled by direct hits. As the guns spoke, infantry and armor surged forward. The assault unfolded with ferocity. Tanks clanked into minefields, engineers racing ahead to clear lanes under fire. Bulldozers pushed aside barbed wire while sappers detonated charges to open paths. Infantry scrambled up steep inclines, rifles slung as they clawed over rocks, bullets whistling past. Syrian machine guns spat from pillboxes, tracers streaking down slopes. Every meter gained came at heavy cost, soldiers falling beside comrades who pressed forward regardless. Tel Faher became the battle's crucible. The strong point crowned a hilltop, its trenches interlocking, bunkers reinforced, and fields of fire commanding every approach. Israeli paratroopers attacked in waves, grenades and satchel charges clearing positions one by one. Hand-to-hand combat broke out in the twisting trenches, rifles used as clubs, bayonets flashing in the dim light of smoke and dust. Hours dragged on as the hill changed hands multiple times. Finally, after relentless pressure, the defenders broke. The hill was scarred, littered with helmets and shattered weapons, but it was taken. Nearby, at Tel Azaziat, another fortress fell after brutal fighting. Airstrikes cratered the defenses, and armored units clawed their way up under cover of smoke. Syrian soldiers fought stubbornly, some refusing to retreat until overwhelmed. When the position finally fell, Israeli commanders could look down from the captured bunkers into the valleys below, the guns that had tormented Galilee now silent. For the civilians who had endured years of shelling, the change was immediate. Families emerging from shelters in kibbutzim watched smoke curling above the heights and realized the guns were being silenced. Some wept openly, relief pouring out after decades of fear. Farmers walked fields still smoldering with shell fire, daring to imagine that their children might one day play outside without running for cover. The offensive pressed deeper as evening fell. Reinforcements pushed up newly cleared routes, widening the breach. Syrian units, battered by bombardment and shaken by the sudden loss of strongholds, began to waver. Commanders ordered withdrawals toward Quneitra, the plateau's administrative hub. Convoys jammed the narrow roads eastward, headlights dimmed as vehicles sped toward Damascus. Abandoned weapons and discarded uniforms lined the routes, evidence of hurried retreat. June 10th brought the climax. Israeli forces advanced in strength, armored columns grinding across the plateau. Villages stood eerily quiet, their inhabitants fled or hiding behind shuttered windows. Quneitra, the largest town on the Golan, emptied as its defenders withdrew. Residents loaded possessions onto carts and trucks, leaving behind homes they would not see again. Streets lay silent when Israeli units entered, the town taken without a final stand. Diplomatic pressure intensified as the offensive surged. In New York, the United Nations Security Council met in emergency session. Moscow warned Israel to halt, its rhetoric sharp, while Washington urged restraint, fearing escalation into superpower confrontation. In the field, messages crackled across radios. Prepare for ceasefire. By midday on June 10th, the orders reached the front. Guns fell silent, columns halted, and soldiers took stock of ground gained. When the quiet came, it felt almost unreal. Men who had spent hours storming trenches now sat on captured ridges, gazing across valleys that stretched into Syria. The horizon that had once threatened them was now under their feet. Relief mingled with exhaustion, triumph with sorrow for comrades lost in the climb. The ceasefire ended 6 days of fighting that had redrawn the map of the Middle East. Israel now held Sinai to the Canal, the West Bank, including Jerusalem, Gaza's coast, and the Golan Heights. The battles of June 9th and 10th had given safety to Galilee, but they also carried consequences that would echo for generations. When June 10th's afternoon arrived, the war's noise drained away. Rifles dropped from ready arms in Sinai, the West Bank, and the Golan, and soldiers stood in a stillness that felt almost unreal after nearly a week of thunder. Radios crackled with terse orders, confirming what weary men already sensed. The war was over. Armies dug in, not for attack but for occupation, as the maps of the Middle East shifted overnight. When the dust settled, Israel stood in control of vast new territories. To the south, its troops occupied the Sinai Peninsula all the way to the Suez Canal. To the west, the Gaza Strip lay under new authority. East Jerusalem and the entire West Bank, once ruled from Amman, now answered to Israeli commanders. And in the north, the Golan Heights, long a perch for Syrian guns, stretched under new watchtowers. What had begun as a desperate gamble for survival had ended with a geographic transformation few could have imagined a week earlier. The first task was control. Military administration spread across the captured areas with startling speed. Curfews were announced by loudspeakers in Arabic, Hebrew, and English. Checkpoints sprouted at crossroads, where soldiers inspected papers and directed traffic. Prisoner of war camps expanded rapidly. Dusty enclosures where thousands of Egyptian, Jordanian, and Syrian soldiers awaited transport. In some places, commanders improvised headquarters in schools or municipal buildings, their walls still decorated with chalk lessons or city maps. Civilians faced dislocation on a massive scale. In the West Bank, tens of thousands fled across the Jordan River, joining lines of refugees that stretched into the East Bank. Families piled belongings onto trucks, donkeys, or their own backs, children clutching pots or blankets as they trudged toward uncertain refuge. On the Golan, Syrian villagers abandoned homes as convoys of military vehicles sped past, leaving entire hamlets silent overnight. In Gaza, residents awoke to new patrols marching past their houses, curfews punctuating the routines of markets and schools. Jerusalem bore the most visible transformation. Within days, bulldozers rumbled through the Maghrabi quarter, a centuries-old neighborhood pressed against the western wall. Houses and narrow lanes gave way to an open plaza, designed to allow worshippers direct access to stones hidden for 19 years behind walls and barbed wire. Residents watched in shock as centuries of history vanished in hours. Meanwhile, religious leaders met urgently with Israeli officials to arrange the safeguarding of holy places. The Haram al-Sharif, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and other sites sacred to three faiths. Guards posted at gates now answered to new commanders, though their task was ancient: to protect sanctity amid turmoil. Scenes across Jerusalem captured the city's collision of awe and anxiety. Israeli soldiers slipped notes into the western wall, their helmets still dusty from battle. Pilgrims entered the old city through gates once closed, their footsteps mingling with rubble-strewn alleys. Arab residents lined up at new checkpoints, uncertain of rules or future. In one moment, history seemed reclaimed. In the next, it felt disrupted beyond recognition. Diplomacy stirred even before the smoke cleared. On June 11th, cables raced between capitals outlining ceasefire terms and prisoner exchanges. Washington pressed for restraint, Moscow demanded withdrawal, and the United Nations dispatched envoys to survey the new lines. In embassies from London to Paris, maps were hastily redrawn, shaded areas expanding where Israel now held ground. Conversations turned to questions without easy answers. Would the new territories be bargaining chips, permanent frontiers, or burdens that would reshape the region's future? Inside Israel, the mood was a mix of triumph and disbelief. Crowds filled Tel Aviv's squares, waving flags and singing songs of victory. Families welcomed home exhausted soldiers with tears and embraces. Yet amid the celebration, ministers gathered behind closed doors to confront new realities. Governing millions of Palestinians and holding vast stretches of territory was no simple matter. Discussions touched on curfews, administration, and international pressure. the practical aftermath of battlefield success. For Arab states, June turned into a month of reckoning. In Cairo, Nasser delivered a resignation speech on June 9th, only to be pressed back into office by crowds who demanded his return. His prestige suffered, but his position endured, sustained by the rallying cry of resistance. In Amman, King Hussein mourned the loss of Jerusalem, his throne shaken by anger from a population that had lost both homes and holy sites. In Damascus, the silence of guns on the Golan brought no peace, only humiliation that fueled vows of revenge. Refugee flows highlighted the scale of upheaval. Along the Allenby Bridge, lines stretched endlessly as families crossed into Jordan, carrying what they could. Aid organizations rushed to provide tents, food, and medical care, but the numbers overwhelmed resources. Stories spread of families separated, of children lost in the crush, of elders collapsing on the march. In the Golan, villages emptied as inhabitants streamed toward Damascus, leaving orchards untended and mosques abandoned. Each crossing etched another scar into the region's social fabric. Meanwhile, Israeli soldiers experienced the surreal transition from combat to administration. Men who had stormed trenches now manned roadblocks, their rifles pointed not at enemy troops, but at passing civilians. Patrols wound through markets where shopkeepers watched warily. In schools, blackboards still bore lessons from the week before, now overlooked as classrooms became barracks. For many soldiers, victory carried a strange weight. The war was over, yet their work had only multiplied. By late June, efforts turned to consolidation. Military governors issued identity cards, organized local councils under supervision, and sought to restore basic services. Water lines were repaired, electricity grids patched, and markets gradually reopened under new rules. The aim was order, not yet peace, but a semblance of control that would allow daily life to continue under new authority. In Jerusalem, the unification of the city carried symbolic power. The first week saw a flood of visitors from across Israel, eager to walk streets long denied to them. Synagogues once shuttered reopened. Christian pilgrims resumed processions, and Muslim custodians coordinated with new officials to safeguard mosques. Yet beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Arab residents feared dispossession, while Israelis debated whether the city's new unity could ever be uncontested. As June drew to a close, diplomats sketched the first outlines of future negotiations. Proposals for prisoner exchanges circulated, with lists of names traded in diplomatic pouches. The United Nations reported on conditions in occupied territories, urging humanitarian corridors and warning of instability. In Arab capitals, communiques spoke of regrouping and rebuilding. In Israel, leaders considered whether to treat their territorial gains as bargaining chips or as new boundaries to be defended. The map of the Middle East, redrawn in less than a week, now demanded interpretation. Soldiers remained at posts. Civilians adjusted to altered realities, and diplomats argued over the meaning of lines on paper. What seemed clear was that the ceasefires of June 1967 had not brought resolution, only a pause. By the end of the month, the rhythm of daily life resumed in some places. Markets reopened, harvests continued, prayers filled mosques and churches. Yet everywhere, the weight of the war lingered. Families grieved for sons lost, refugees searched for new shelter, and soldiers patrolled streets far from home. The guns had fallen silent, but the echoes of their fire still shaped every decision, every conversation, every dream of what might come next. The silence of June's ceasefires gave way to a new kind of noise. The shuffle of papers in cabinet rooms, the echo of speeches in parliaments, the measured tones of diplomats. The war was over, but the work of explaining, justifying, and bargaining had only begun. Across the Middle East, soldiers returned to barracks, yet statesmen stepped into the spotlight, carrying the weight of 6 days that had remade the map. In Israel, the jubilation of victory mingled with calculation. Crowds filled Tel Aviv's boulevards, waving flags and singing songs. But inside government offices, the mood was more sober. Ministers debated what to do with the territories now under their control. The Sinai stretched like a vast shield in the south. Gaza lay under tight watch. The West Bank, with its hundreds of thousands of Palestinians pressed against the heartland. And Jerusalem, once divided, was now whole under Israeli rule. Some argued these were bargaining chips to trade for peace. Others insisted they must never be relinquished. The cabinet split between pragmatists and maximalists, with Prime Minister Levi Eshkol balancing on the edge of fragile consensus. Generals submitted reports with the same blunt tone they had used before the war. Defense lines must be established quickly, they argued. Roads must be secured, outposts fortified, and supply chains built for the long haul. Yitzhak Rabin pressed for strategic depth, warning that without defenses the gains would tempt counterattack. Others cautioned against overextending the army. Each map spread on the table carried both pride and anxiety. Pride in what had been taken, anxiety about how to hold it. Jerusalem posed the most immediate challenge. The city, unified by force, now required administration that balanced its spiritual weight with its political volatility. Municipal workers reopened streets cleared of rubble. Bulldozers finished their work in the Mughrabi Quarter, and worshippers surged into the Western Wall Plaza. Ministers spoke of eternal unity, yet lawyers drafted new regulations for permits and zoning. The sacred and the bureaucratic collided daily, making governance as complex as the battle had been swift. Beyond Israel, Arab capitals struggled to absorb the shock of defeat. In Cairo, Gamal Abdel Nasser walked a line between resignation and renewal. On June 9th, he had announced he would step down, only to be met by massive demonstrations demanding he remain. Crowds surged through the streets, chanting his name, not ready to let their symbol of defiance fade. He returned to office, chastened but still powerful, his rhetoric sharpened by loss. Egypt licked its wounds, burying soldiers and reorganizing command, even as Nasser vowed that Sinai would not remain lost forever. Amman wore its grief more quietly. King Hussein faced the despair of losing East Jerusalem, a jewel in Hashemite custody since 1948. The king visited hospitals, spoke to refugees pouring across the river, and assured his people that the West Bank would not be forgotten. Yet behind his words lay a gnawing sense of vulnerability. His kingdom had been cut in half, his prestige battered, his throne resting on the uneasy loyalty of a displaced population. In Damascus, the regime survived humiliation with fury. The Golan Heights had fallen in 2 days, its defenses overrun, its villages emptied. Syrian leaders promised revenge, broadcasting fiery speeches to mask their disarray. Soldiers dug new lines east of Kenitra, their spades striking earth still blackened from battle. Radio Damascus thundered vows of resistance, its words carrying to every corner of the Arab world, even as its armies licked wounds in silence. The international stage filled with hurried consultations. At the United Nations in New York, delegates crowded into chambers to debate resolutions, each speech layered with accusation and warning. Soviet diplomats demanded withdrawal, denouncing Israel as aggressor. American representatives urged negotiations, cautious not to alienate allies while acknowledging realities on the ground. Smaller nations offered proposals that evaporated as soon as they were spoken, swept away by the rivalries of superpowers. Envoys traveled the region in a blur of meetings. U Thant, the UN Secretary General, toured battlefields, his motorcade winding past wreckage in Sinai and checkpoints in Jerusalem. He listened to generals describe victories and refugees describe flight, both speaking truths difficult to reconcile. European diplomats moved between capitals, urging compromise. Their suggestions met with polite nods, but little action. The shock of war had produced urgency, but urgency did not guarantee agreement. By July, Israel's ministers faced a pressing question: how to govern newly acquired lands. Military governors issued identity cards, restored basic services, and sought to maintain order. Yet beneath the surface, resistance simmered. Palestinian leaders convened quietly in towns like Nablus and Hebron, debating how to respond. Some called for cooperation to ease daily life. Others demanded defiance. Rumors of underground networks circulated, even as public life resumed under the watch of foreign soldiers. Summer's heat settled over capitals, but diplomacy did not rest. In August, all eyes turned to Sudan, where Arab leaders gathered in Khartoum. Delegations arrived from Cairo, Damascus, Amman, and beyond, each carrying the bitterness of June, but also the necessity of coordination. Hotels filled with ministers and generals, corridors hummed with hurried consultations, and the press swarmed lobbies for scraps of information. Inside the summit halls, speeches carried the weight of defeat and the determination to recover. Cairo's representatives insisted Egypt would not rest until Sinai was regained. Damascus's envoys demanded recognition of Syria's right to resist. Amman's delegation pressed for international support for refugees, their plight too vast to ignore. Despite differences, one message rang clear: no peace with Israel, no recognition, no negotiations. The communiqué that emerged became known for its stark simplicity: the three no's. For Israel, the words of Khartoum closed the door on immediate diplomacy. Hopes that conquered territories might be exchanged swiftly for recognition, and treaties dissolved in the face of Arab unity against compromise. The conference hall in Sudan became as decisive in its way as the battlefields of June. Where guns had drawn lines, words now hardened them. The summer of 1967 ended not with the sound of artillery, but with the ink of resolutions and communiques. Borders stood redrawn, soldiers manned new trenches, and diplomats returned home with speeches rather than agreements. The war had ended in 6 days. The struggle to define its meaning had only begun. Even before June's turmoil had faded, a new chapter of fighting began across the region. The battles were over, but the lines they left behind were raw and jagged, separating soldiers who watched each other through binoculars across trenches and canals. From September to November 1967, the region learned that the war's end was not peace, but a new beginning, marked by uneasy standoffs, furious diplomacy, and the slow grind of entrenchment. Along the Suez Canal, silence rarely lasted. Egyptian artillerymen, positioned on the western bank, tested their range against Israeli troops dug into sand berms on the eastern shore. Shells whistled across the water, answered by counterfire that churned the canal's edges. Patrols crept along embankments, exchanging bursts of rifle fire. Civilians in the nearby city of Ismailia heard explosions echo at night, their windows rattling long after Cairo declared the ceasefire secure. Egyptian commanders knew their army had been broken in June, but they sought to prove it was not finished. Every exchange along the canal was less a battle than a declaration that the struggle would continue. In the north, the Golan Heights became another simmering front. Syrian artillery, hastily redeployed after June's collapse, opened sporadic fire on Israeli villages below. Farmers returned to fields with plows and tractors, but always under the shadow of gun barrels above. At night, tracer fire lit the slopes, and children in kibbutzim fell asleep in bunkers dug beneath their homes. Israeli units fortified the captured ridges, carving new trenches and laying wire. Both sides understood that the 6 days of June had decided nothing permanently. Inside Israel, the transformation was profound. Victory had tripled the state's territory, bringing under its control more than 1 million Palestinians. Soldiers who had returned from Sinai and Jerusalem now found themselves posted as occupiers, manning roadblocks in Nablus, patrolling alleys in Hebron, and issuing permits in Gaza. Military governors established offices in schoolhouses and municipal buildings, issuing orders by megaphone. Markets reopened under curfew, buses ran under escort, and a routine of occupation settled into place. The army, once defined by lightning offense, now learned the slower tasks of administration. The mood among Israelis was conflicted. Streets rang with songs of triumph, yet questions pressed in. Were these lands bargaining chips or the foundations of new borders? Could they be held without sparking endless resistance? Religious leaders hailed the capture of Jerusalem as redemption, while pragmatists warned of international isolation. In cafes and parliament halls alike, arguments stretched late into the night. The war had delivered security, but also a burden that weighed heavier with each passing week. In Arab capitals, the summer's bitterness hardened into autumn resolve. Cairo repaired its army under Soviet guidance, trains unloading crates of weapons at depots along the Nile. Advisors in Moscow supplied uniforms, oversaw drills, while Nasser delivered speeches promising that June's setback was temporary. Damascus vowed revenge, broadcasting fiery rhetoric even as it fortified new lines. Amman, its throne shaken, struggled to absorb hundreds of thousands of refugees streaming from the West Bank. Camps swelled along the river's east bank, rows of tents multiplying under the harsh sun. For those who crossed, the promise of return never faded, but neither did the reality of displacement. Diplomacy kept pace with the military maneuvers. At the United Nations, debates stretched week after week through October and November. Delegates clashed over the language of resolutions. Should Israel withdraw from all territories or merely territories? Was recognition a precondition or a result of negotiations? Drafts circulated, amended, and returned, each word dissected by ambassadors who knew that phrasing carried the weight of armies. On November 22nd, the Security Council adopted Resolution 242. Its carefully balanced text called for withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict, an acknowledgement of the right of every state in the area to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries. The ambiguity was deliberate, a fragile bridge between irreconcilable demands. In New York, diplomats hailed it as progress. In the region, it sounded less like resolution than postponement. Israel welcomed its call for peace, but noted the absence of the word all. Arab leaders emphasized withdrawal, yet clung to Khartoum's refusal to negotiate directly. While envoys traded speeches, soldiers continued their routines along the new lines. Israeli patrols moved cautiously along the canal, ducking from sporadic sniper fire. Egyptian units practiced crossing drills at night, their rafts hidden under camouflage nets. In the Golan, tractors carved new positions into rocky slopes, while below, Galilee farmers harvested crops with rifles propped against tractor seats. The map had changed, But the rhythm of danger remained. Autumn also brought rituals of remembrance. In Israel, families lit candles for the fallen, their names read aloud in ceremonies across the country, cemeteries filled with fresh graves, flowers placed beside stones carved with the dates June 1967. In Cairo, mothers wore black, carrying photographs of sons lost in Sinai. In Amman, refugees told stories of villages left behind, recounting street corners and orchards as if to anchor memory against erasure. The human cost of the Six-Day War stretched far beyond the briefness of its battles. By November's end, the Middle East had settled into a tense new routine. The battlefields were quiet but bristling, diplomacy active but unresolved. Israel held its new frontiers, soldiers digging into positions along the canal, Gaza, the West Bank, and the Golan. Arab states rebuilt and rearmed, their leaders vowing that the losses of June would not stand. In New York, Resolution 242 marked a diplomatic milestone, but on the ground, its words changed little. The war's lightning speed had astonished the world. Its aftermath proved slower, heavier, and more uncertain. By the close of 1967, the maps had been redrawn, the armies repositioned, and the peoples of the region left to live under the weight of new realities. The guns were silent, but the struggle had merely shifted, from battlefields to borders, from open war to the long shadow of what would come after.